With the current UFC roster filled with over 619 active fighters at the moment, it goes without saying that fans are somewhat spoiled for choice. But as you can imagine, this has resulted in a few top 10 contenders taking a break from the spotlight with the intention of returning better than ever. Who are these UFC fighters, though? And how likely are they to make a comeback? For all this and more, stay tuned. First up on our list is Gunnar Nelson, the 33-year-old Icelandic mixed martial artist who made a name for himself in the welterweight division back in 2012. It didn't take long since his debut for Nelson to become known as one of the most brutal submission artists in the octagon, who not only brought immense strength to the league, but immeasurable skill as well. After reaching a record of just 4-0, he found himself in his first headline slot, which saw him standing face-to-face with Rick Story, and unfortunately for Nelson, the pressure was a bit too much to handle, resulting in him losing the match by split decision. Things didn't look great for him in the next match either, which saw Gunnar being outworked by veteran fighter Damian Maia in a rather interesting grappling match. Despite these two losses, Nelson was still one of the most celebrated fighters in the octagon and used this support base of his to bounce back, earning 2 Performance of the Night honors in his next 2 bouts. Suffice to say, the man had a lot of potential and just needed to warm up to the high intensity of the league. Nelson then lost against Santiago Ponzinibbio, who was able to knock Gunnar out in the first round. But this win was a pretty controversial one, and there's no doubt that fans want Nelson to come back and take Santiago out. Come on, Gunnar, we're waiting. Next up on our list is Tyson Pedro, a fan favorite that hasn't been seen in the octagon since December of 2018. And while Pedro isn't exactly the most decorated of UFC fighters, with a record of just 3-3, it must be said that fans miss his tenacity and ability to deal some rather significant damage to his opponents. The Australian native has, after all, taken out names like Paul Craig and Khalil Roundtree Jr. after all. But the great thing about Pedro is just how much showmanship he puts into each of his bouts. Even when he lost back-to-back against Ovince St. Preux and Mauricio Shogun Rua, Pedro made sure to give his fans what they'd been waiting for. And when it comes to current UFC runs, it must be said that the league is very much missing what Tyson Pedro brought to the table. Everything seems too serious at the moment, and Pedro had the ability to step in the octagon in a carefree way and put on a show. In other words, he was a fun fighter, and we'd love to see him perform once more. It's also important to note that this return of his is quite likely. In fact, Pedro was scheduled to face off against Vinicius Moreira in February of last year. After withdrawing because of an injury, he later confirmed that he would be returning in September of this year, but as you now know, that never happened. Another fighter that left us far too early was Veronica Makedo, who had a pretty tough time making it in the UFC. For those of you who don't remember, Makedo actually stepped into the octagon on short notice against Ashley Evans-Smith, who unfortunately pummeled her to Kingdom Come, but allowed Makedo to show that she had some real skill that was in need of refinement. It would take her a grand total of 4 bouts until she finally picked up her first victory against Polyana Viana, but while things were looking up for her, Andrea Lee stepped in and brought her progress to a halt. But she continued to work hard for herself, although she ended up losing to B. Malecki in her most recent fight. It must be said that she actually had Malecki on the ropes and would have won if she hadn't gassed herself out. Suffice to say, Makedo has a lot to learn before she can rise to the top of the UFC ladder, and after taking some much-needed time off from being beaten to a pulp, we have no doubt that she's been working on her technique in the background. In fact, she's learned something from every match she's lost, which makes her comeback an anticipated one, with many still standing in her corner. That being said, we're hoping she does make a return at flyweight, as she's a bit out of her depth when it comes to the bantamweight division. And then we have Kron Gracie, who last fought back in October 2019, which saw him lose to Cub Swanson in Palm Springs. But considering how Gracie is somewhat of a rookie, having just completed 1 UFC bout before taking on the 36-fight veteran, the loss was to be expected. At least that's what the experts at the time believed. Kron didn't exactly take the loss well, though. In fact, it would appear that his confidence has been poorly affected by his performance on that night. As a result, he decided to take some time away from the spotlight and pressure of the league, readying himself for a return sometime in the future. And there's a reason why fans want to see this comeback. Gracie is a phenomenal fighter who, prior to his time in the UFC, spent his days fighting on behalf of Ryzen and the Real Fighting Championship. His grappling is absolutely out of this world, and his black belt in judo allows him to take on opponents that are practically twice his size. He does have some weaknesses, though, all of which were taken advantage of by Swanson in their last bout. As such, we very much hope that Gracie has been working on strengthening these gaps in his ability, and if that is indeed the case, his return is going to be something to behold. According to sources, he may be in talks to tackle Danny Henry soon, so we might not have long to wait. Probably one of the most anticipated returns as far as the combat sport is concerned is Tatiana Suarez, who over the years has been called the female Khabib because of her incredible performance in the UFC. For those of you who don't know, Tatiana is currently undefeated in the UFC, hence her nickname, and is by far the greatest threat to championship fighters like Valentina Shevchenko. As of right now, she has only competed in strawweight bouts, but intended on making her way into the flyweight division earlier this year. Unfortunately for her, though. An injury sustained during training stopped this from happening. Suffice to say, fans of Suarez have become pretty frustrated by just how prone the athlete is to injuries, which have kept her out of the octagon since June of 2019. And it's a real pity we don't have her in the spotlight right now. She averages precisely 6.47 takedowns per 15 minutes, with her having secured a grand total of 22 in just 5 fights. In other words, she performs to the best of her ability and takes down the fellow combatants with a fascinating amount of ease. It's this amount of control that fans have been missing from the UFC in the last few years, so we really cannot wait for her to make a comeback sometime soon. As soon as her injury heals, Suarez is likely to take on Jessica Ai, a reasonably ranked fighter that has yet to book a fight for 2022. Last but not least, we have Conor McGregor, a choice that many of you might regard as being quite controversial, considering how hated he is by the profession at the moment. But when it really comes down to it, McGregor is a showman of note. Regardless of how much you may love or hate the guy, there's no doubt that he has some serious skills in the octagon. But as of late, the man hasn't exactly showed off the promise he has within him. In fact, it feels like Conor has become almost preoccupied with the image he has created for himself over the last few years. Known by many as the most controversial fighter to ever set foot in the league, McGregor's a bit of a joke right now. We last saw him compete earlier this year against Dustin Poirier, where his leg unfortunately bent backwards in a rather horrifying fashion. After being carried out on a stretcher, McGregor continued to speak out about how he would have swept the floor with Poirier if the fight had continued, something that fans of the UFC doubt, considering how Poirier actually had the upper hand. Suffice to say, McGregor has a lot to prove when he comes back to the octagon, and a great performance is all he needs to get rid of his clown status. And there you have it, the 6 UFC Fighters fans can't wait to see in the future. Which of these combatants do you most want to see in the octagon again? And what do you think about their future in the sport? Be sure to let us know in the comment section down below.